Hazy IPAs, New England IPAs, no matter what you want to call them, they are probably the most popular style of beer to brew right now. However, a lot of fledgling homebrewers that are tackling these big beefy beers definitely bring back some beers that have some mistakes in them. So we figured we would address those and say, if you want to brew a hazy or New England style IPA, avoid screwing it up.
So we're going to tell you everything not to do in today's video on how to screw up a hazy.
All right, let's jump into the first and most common effluent in the room, the oxygen. Everyone has heard that hazies are very difficult to do because of how sensitive they are to oxygen. So what's going on? When are you getting oxygen in your beer?
You're getting oxygen in a number of places, actually. So you should be putting it in at the very beginning. That is actually okay. A lot of people think that LoDO or low dissolved oxygen methods mean that you're not putting any oxygen in at any time. You are putting it in at the beginning, but you are trying to avoid it anytime after pitching your yeast. And that comes when it comes to dry hopping, when it comes to packaging, whether you're putting it in a keg, whether you're bottling, and then all the way up to the point where it hits the glass.
That's right. So the most common one that I see, which is a pretty simple thing, is a lot of people that get into this homebrew idea of fermentation needs to go for 3+ weeks before you go into transferring. In a hazy, you need to plan on a short fermentation. So if you let it sit in your primary fermenter for a long time, that's definitely risking picking up oxygen, especially after your dry hop addition.
Yeah, so one of the most common introductions to oxygenation of this style of beer is during the dry hop phase, because what do homebrewers do? When they got a dry hop, they're gonna pop their lid, they're gonna pop off their airlock, and they're gonna throw their dry hops right in. So as you're doing that, you're actually introducing oxygen to the beer, and then having that extra hop material in there is only gonna exacerbate that problem.
Ways that we avoid this is, first of all, dry hopping a little bit early, planning on a very active fermentation during dry hop so you have CO2 expelling. Or even better yet, what we like to do if we have to open up anything is we'll be able to actually blow CO2 into the beer while we're opening it up to dry hop. So we're kind of introducing a positive pressure zone that pushes out oxygen at that state. And again, the whole start from brew day to packaging with a hazy, you should be trying to aim for that about 10 days total. That way, there is going to be some slight activity even going into your bottles, especially because you want that yeast to be really active during that bottling phase so that it can help purge your bottles of oxygen when you're doing that.
Like Peter said, CO2 is going to be your friend. A lot of you out there don't have CO2 at the disposal, so like we recommend, if you are bottling and you don't have any way to purge those bottles out, just make sure that you're getting that beer in as soon as you see that fermentation is complete. This might be as little as 5 days, so don't be afraid to make sure that beer gets in there as fresh as you possibly can get it.
For those of you out there that are saying, all right, I know this. I know how to not get oxygen in my beer. I'm LoDO transferring into kegs and everything like that because I'm transferring under pressure. A common mistake that we see is people transferring under pressure into their Cornelius kegs without actually purging their Cornelius kegs of oxygen in the first place.
Yeah, so when you're cleaning your keg out, it's a really simple process to do. Once you get your sanitizer in there, usually we like to have some hot sanitizer. You're going to push that sanitizer out with CO2. That's going to make your keg anaerobic. And at that point, when you do transfer, you don't want to open up that lid anymore. You want to transfer down through usually your liquid side.
Just slightly pop that pressure relief valve to make sure that the CO2 is coming out.
Open up your
slowly.
relief valve so that it can displace the CO2 that's already in the keg.
And that's pretty much it. If you've got any more questions on how to keep everything LoDO, then feel free to leave those in the comments below. Other than one last tip that we have that we do to almost every single beer, and we get a lot of questions about it, and that is a little bit of ascorbs.
Ascorbic acid is essentially vitamin C, and this will actually really mitigate any kind of exposure to oxygen throughout the process, and might even save you if you don't do a perfect LoDO transfer.
Absolutely. If you ever see those pre-sliced apples in the store, the reason those pre-sliced apples are not brown because they're covered in ascorbic acid. So let's move on to the second and probably lesser known things that go into making a hazy and things that you can screw up. And let's just talk about malt.
Yeah, so malt in general is something that, and mashing, I guess, is something that we see people do wrong in a lot of different ways. I think the first off is the adjuncts and the type of adjuncts that people are using. So typically, hazy IPAs will have up to about 40% or so of adjunct malts in them.
And what we mean by that is things like flaked oats or even oat malts, wheat, flaked barley would even do the role, unmalted wheat, things that have a lot of proteins that are going to give you that hazy kind of finesse in the final product. First of all, we see a lot of people not actually using up to 40%. They'll use like 10% adjunct and then wonder why the beer is not hazy at the end. But you can use up to 40%. However, that does come with some finesse and techniques to make sure that you maximize what you're getting off of your mash.
One of the techniques that we use here a lot of times is if we don't have a very, very high enzymatic base malt that we're using, we might actually have to add a little bit of amyloglucosidase or AMG. And typically, the easiest way to do that, just to make sure you get full conversion, is add it right at the last 10 minutes or so of your mash. If you add this to the fermentation, you'll end up with a brewed IPA, which is not what we're going for.
Right.
But yeah, just a little bit of that in your mash will actually help that conversion proceed.
Yeah, there's a couple different enzymes that you can add during the mash. The amyloglucosidase, so there's also Amylex 4T, which is the same as like a really high temperature, really strong workhorse of an enzyme that works at that mash temperature. But if you don't have enzymes at your disposal, an easy way to do it is just to add a highly enzymatic base malt. We use Heidelberg for almost all of our GCs or hazies, and it works fantastically.
So another thing that we see people doing wrong with their grain bill is Peter mentioned there's a lot of adjunct malts, but one thing he did not mention are malts like caramel malts, malts like Munich malts, even Vienna malts. Really just don't have a place in these beers because you're trying to keep those colors light. You're trying to avoid any of those sweeter, more Maillard type flavor profiles.
Yeah, all your adjunct malts should be those big, puffy, high protein malts. But one thing that comes on the other side of that is making sure that your mash doesn't stick. So I think almost a necessity when you're doing these hazies is making sure that you're adding rice hulls.
Yeah, depending on your grain bed, you might be able to get away with some degree of flake stuff, but rice hulls will definitely come in to save the day when you might be adding 4 or 5 pounds of flaked oats into a 5-gallon batch of beer.
Yeah, and finally, because this is a high adjunct beer, and again by that what we mean is there's not a lot of base malt that's really doing work for you, it's really important that you're hitting that lower mash temperature and that you're also making sure that your pH for your mash is in a good range so that your enzymes are going to be able to do work for you. If you mash too high or if your pH is slightly too high, what we're aiming for is that 5.2 or just a little bit under, then your enzymes aren't going to work for you and you're going to end up with either too sweet of a beer or not an alcoholic enough beer.
Yep, I know a lot of people will come in complaining that their beer quote unquote stalled out because it's finishing mid-teens for your gravity readings. And the reality is it didn't stall out. You just didn't quite get a full conversion and you probably mashed way too high. In my opinion, and I think what we generally do here is anything above about 150 degrees is too high for a beer like this. You're not going to get that full conversion. So we actually try to shoot low and then if anything slowly raise up through that mash range. So, 145 is probably plenty warm for you.
Yeah, and then feel free to, do a longer mash if you're worried about that not getting full conversion within the time limit because you're mostly focused on the beta amylase. Anyways, that pretty much covers the malt side of things. Again, if you have questions, leave them in the comments below. And let's move on to probably the biggest thing when it comes to all of the hazy world, and that's basically just taking care of your hops and making sure they don't give you any bad flavors.
Yeah, let's try not to abuse our hops because these are really what make this beer, right? So first off, there's a lot of sort of off flavors that shouldn't be in hazies. They're going to be things like grassiness, things like an assertive bitterness, overall aggressive hop profile. And hazies should be none of this, right?
Hazies, if you look at the style guidelines, hazies are actually relatively low IBUs. There's really not an excuse to be using a lot of upfront hops. So let's start with what we're doing during that bittering phase that you'd see in most recipes that you've got.
So we're doing exactly nothing.
Zero.
I see recipe after recipe still today come in and people are still have a 60-minute edition almost every single time. And if they ask me for advice, my first thing is you don't need that. There's because you're adding so many hops late in the boil or even at a whirlpool, you don't need to bitter at all. These beers are not bitter beers by any standard.
And what you got to realize is you're adding a bunch of high alpha hops in these late additions. And so when you're thinking about, even your flame out or even a whirlpool addition, although the rate of alpha acid isomerization, which means the rate at which your hops are giving you IBUs in your beer, is slower, it's still happening. And since you're adding in the whirlpool, I would say a minimum of 4 ounces of these high alpha hops, there's still a lot of room for you to get all the bitterness that you're going to need with just a flame out and back hop addition.
Speaking of the whirlpool, let's talk about how people screw up their hop additions and their hop varieties more so in the whirlpool.
I get a ton of people coming in here and saying, all right, so I'm going to add a bunch of hops and I'm going to do this massive whirlpool. I'm going to throw them all in there and let them sit there for an hour before I chill down. That's a bad idea.
Yeah, so that's that grassiness term that we've thrown around. That's a really good way to get that grassiness, is having too long of a whirlpool, letting your hops sit sort of in that middle temperature range for too much time. Our general recommendation is that you shoot for a sort of hot side, 190 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes is what you want those hops to be exposed at.
You do want to make sure that you're maximizing the exposure of those hops to your wort. That means if you're bagging, you got to make sure that it's somehow flowing around. If you've got a whirlpool going, that's nice. Or if you're not bagging, you got to do the exact opposite and just make sure that you're straining it out before it gets to the fermenter. But whatever you're doing, make sure that it maximizes that exposure, because if the hops are sitting all clumped together, there's a good chance that you're not utilizing those. And hazies can be expensive beers. You want to make sure that you're getting everything you possibly can out of all those hops.
Also, make sure that you're choosing the proper variety and make sure that those hops are nice and fresh.
Right.
Grassiness can also be caused by using old hops. For varieties, we're gonna stay away from our classic West Coast varieties like Columbus and Chinook, right?
Yep.
Instead, we're going to lean more towards things like Simcoe, things like
Mosaic,
Galaxy,
Equinox,
Equinox,
Azaka.
all those kind of bright, naturally citrusy and naturally sort of tropical fruit type hop profiles.
Right. If you wanted to add a little bit of Columbus for balance, that's fine. But again, it's a smaller addition. It's not that big 4-ounce plus addition that you're doing on Whirlpool.
Yeah, we're not going for great beer here.
Yeah, so to recap real quick, things that can give you grassiness on that Whirlpool side are using too much hops at too hot for too long. It could be using old hops, and then it can also be when you're transferring out of your Whirlpool into your fermenter, if you're leaving all that hot material and your beer ferments on that much hot material, you're really risking that grassiness too. Let's go into the dry hop, and probably that's the last big thing you do when it comes to making a hazy or juicy. And to disclaim, we think the biggest and best hop addition in a hazy should be that Whirlpool. So 4+ ounces is our go-to there. I would say even 6 to 8 ounces is totally fine on that Whirlpool. That's going to give you the most flavor without you wasting a bunch of money.
Yeah, we've made plenty of great hazies without even having a dry hop addition in them. So, but with that said, we make sure that we leave all that hop material in the boil kettle. None of it hits the fermenter.
That's right. So let's go into that dry hop, which is another great way to just punch up that overall flavor. And also with biotransformation that happens in this dry hop, you can get some new flavors that you wouldn't necessarily get in other hops.
Yeah, I think the number one thing we see people doing wrong with the dry hop is just dry hopping way too late. And then leaving those hops in there for way too long.
Yeah, so what you need to be making sure is that you're actually opening up your fermenter and dry hopping just as you see active fermentation starting to collapse. That means your yeast is still very, very active. There's still a bunch of sugars going in there, and your yeast are going to be able to do what's called biotransformation, which basically means cleaving non-aromatic compounds that are in the hops and taking some of those and turning them into aromatic oils that you can taste.
And here's the catch to biotransformation, dry hopping. As soon as those hops hit the beer, you now have a sort of countdown timer, unless you're using something like lupulin or cryo hops. In the sense of regular hop pellets, we try not to let them be exposed to the beer for any more than 4 or 5 days. So at that point, you need some way of either removing those hops. That could be as simple as bagging them, or having a dump valve on the bottom of your fermenter.
There's been a number of times that we have thrown our beer into its final keg before the beer is actually done, just to make sure that we're getting that beer off the hops. And that's totally fine, because then the beer can continue to ferment and finish out in that keg, and then all you got to do is wait a couple days, chill it down, and it's still good to go. You get a little bit of spunding action, which is totally okay.
If you're going into bottles, you're still playing with this countdown timer. You might risk overcarbonating your beer if it's not quite finished out all the way, but if it were me, that's a risk worth taking over having an oxidized beer.
Yeah, you definitely want to make sure that that beer is fresh and popping. And if you're worried about the beer not being completely finished, just back off your priming sugar a little bit and you should be good to go.
Well, that's it, Peter. I think that is everything that we have seen people doing wrong. And if you noticed, we have not talked about yeast, and that is because that should be the least of your concern, is choosing the yeast variety. Make sure that you have all these other techniques down pat before you start playing with yeast and really worry about the yeast strain. It is the least impactful on this beer style.
Yeah, there are a lot of yeast that'll do biotransformation, obviously some better than others, but all yeast will taste phenomenal. We've done this with Belgian yeast, we've done this with American yeast, we've done it with all sorts of different yeasts. The biggest thing when it comes to yeast is still just making sure you take good care of it, which we actually cover in our 5 tips for making better beer all the time. You should check that video out.
All right, we'll see you next time on Genus Brewing. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully your hazy just got a little better.
Cheers, guys. Like, subscribe, buy some merch, things like that.
Beer kits on our website.